Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Oliver Trump from Actionstep. I've been leading our UK business for the past 3.5 years. Today's webinar is focused on connecting Actionstep to your banks using AccessPay as the bank integration method. I'm really excited to be hosting this webinar as we've been working with AccessPay for the past year and have now become partners. Also, Actionstep are now able to generate a payment file which AccessPay can use to automate payments. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tom Livick from AccessPay. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Oliver. Yes, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Tom Livick. I joined AccessPay in 2014, and we onboarded our first law firm in 2015. And since then, we have a variety of different law firms, both multinational, national, and regional law firms. So super excited to be talking about this new partnership with ActionStep today.
Great, thanks, Tom. So in today's webinar, or fireside chat more like, we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so discussing what do we mean when we talk about automation? Why is payment automation important to law firms? What does automation look like with ActionStep and AccessPay? What are the challenges with payment automation? And finally, what advice and recommendations would ActionStep and AccessPay give to law firms looking to automate? If you do have any questions throughout, please go to the chat box and we'll do our best to answer any of those questions as we go. If we don't answer them throughout, we may also have time at the end for a few questions. This webinar is being recorded, so if you would like to watch it again or share it with your colleagues, you will receive a link via email at the end of the session. So let's get started. I think a good starting point is to define what we mean by payment automation, and then we can move on to the benefits. So, Tom, what do we mean when we talk about payment automation?
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, so most organizations that we talk to, whether it's for office or supplier payments or even client payments, are checking their practice management system and manually entering the payment details directly into their bank portal or online system. So this is sort of the first level of what we hear when we talk to organizations about payments. The next level is that some organizations will speak about creating a payment file from their practice management system and then manually uploading that payment file into online banking. So the point is they're still using online banking as the mechanism of getting the payment file into the bank, even though their PMS, their practice management system, may be generating a payment file itself. And probably finally, the most advanced form of law firm that we speak to today may have automated, at least in the UK, their BACS process. So that's obviously a 3-day cycle, possibly for client or office payments, where they're not using the bank portal to automatically send the BACS file to the scheme, but they're actually using a BACS process and effectively have automated those non-urgent payment types. So that's what we hear today, and really there is a final level of automation, which is what we talk about, which is where you're able to get a payment file out from, in this case, ActionStep, and take that payment file and deliver it directly to the bank. And these could be for CHAPS payments, for example, or faster payments, or BACS. It doesn't really matter. In fact, some of the law firms that we're talking to, international law firms, are also able to process those international payments as well without using online banking. And so for this webinar, when we refer to payment automation, we're referring to the ability to automatically take a payment file from ActionStep and using AccessPay, automatically deliver the payment file directly to the law firm's bank without using bank portals or without using online banking. And the second point here is the type of payments that can be made via this process is actually universal. It doesn't matter whether it's a client payment, an office payment, payroll, or even expenses. It applies to any payment type, whether it's BACS, faster payments, CHAPS, and even international. So that's the type of automation. When we refer to bank automation, it's the ability to deliver any bank-to-bank payment without using online banking, without using those bank portals to deliver the payment file directly to the bank. Hopefully that makes some sense, Oliver.
Yeah, that's great. No, I appreciate you going into detail there, Tom. So now that we've defined what we mean by payment automation, what do you think? Why do you think law firms should care about payment automation? Why is this important to law firms? What are kind of the advantages that this offers?
Yeah, there are three key points really. I'll go into a little bit more detail, but on each one. But effectively, the three key points are efficiency. So it's the fact that there is a cashier, there's somebody in the finance team who actually is logging into online banking, and by automating that process, they no longer need to do that. Second is fraud, and the third is human error. So let's just talk about those in a bit more detail. So on the efficiency piece, this is where there's actually a tangible return on investment. So what we're able to measure is effectively that an organization is using online banking, and they may have 3, 4, or even 10 cashiers, maybe even more, who are logging into online banking, maybe 80%, 100% of the time, to be able to process those payments because they're using online banking as the mechanism of getting the payment file into the bank account. And obviously, if we automate that process, if we're not having to use online banking anymore, then those cashiers not only do they not need to do that process anymore, which is very mundane, very manual process, but it means that for the law firm, they can allow those cashiers to go and do something that's much more beneficial to the business. So that's the efficiency piece. Secondly is fraud. So fraud is becoming more and more prevalent, and the fraudsters are becoming clever in terms of how they can commit that fraud. And what we're saying is that not that online banking is not secure. That's obviously, online banking is extremely secure. However, what we're saying is by using online banking as a mechanism to deliver the payment file to the bank means that organization is opening itself up to more fraud risk. I hate to use the word collusion, but we've seen it where within that organization, the collusion could happen, and then obviously that fraud risk becomes very significant. And because we're reducing the number of cashiers, the number of people who are having to log into online banking, we're reducing that risk of fraud. The final point, the human error, unfortunately, we're all human. And it's very easy to put a decimal place in the wrong point when you're making a payment, or to spell somebody's name wrong, whether that's an individual or an organization, a company name. And that causes all sorts of issues in terms of having sent that payment file to the bank, which is a human error, then trying to stop the bank send that payment on and actually settling the payment. And obviously that's an escalation process inside the organization as well. So those are the three advantages of automating the process.
Yeah, I think those are key points, and we talk to firms all the time that want to verify payee bank details, and obviously you can do that if you're doing one payment at a time. But they also want efficiency. They also want to automate, and if you're uploading a payment file with all of these payee bank details, it doesn't verify that traditionally. So I think this is a really key step forward for firms that are wanting both security and efficiency at the same time.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so I think it's obviously helpful to give context to the benefits. But Tom, how would firms connect to a law firm's bank directly from Actionstep? Or how do you connect directly to a law firm's bank directly through Actionstep?
Yeah, so the diagram that you can see on the screen now shows the process of how this actually happens. We refer to this as the wheel slide, or the 10,000-foot view of how the automation actually works. So if we can talk that through just briefly now, I'll talk through the points going across the top, which is the payment side, and then the statement data coming back in, which is the bottom half, the bottom half of the wheel. So the first point that needs to happen is Actionstep generating that payment file, which you can see on the left-hand side. And without using any form of manual intervention, we're able to connect to Actionstep and pull that payment file into AccessPay, and then we start with the process going across the top. You mentioned just then, Oliver, about confirmation of payee, validating, making sure that the bank account details, the bank account name is the same as the sort code and account number, and the validation step that's mentioned here. One of those steps that we can carry out is confirmation of payee, checking that the bank account name, the bank account holder's name, and the bank account details are correct. The next step of the process is validation and control, and this is actually almost a university degree in its own right. But because we're only looking at the 10,000 foot view, one of the key points to talk about here is around approvals. So what we're saying is on the right hand side where it says bank, client bank accounts, is we're saying don't use online banking anymore. So the question is, well, that's fine, but where does the approval process happen? If it's not happening on the right hand side, where is it going to happen? And the answer to that is very straightforward. Either it can happen in Actionstep, and the approval of that payment file can happen before that payment file is released, or most common, at least in the first 6 to 12 months of automation with a law firm, is we see that they want the approval happening inside AccessPay, and we've got a very both complex and also flexible approval process to allow that that approval process to happen with the payment file before it gets delivered to the bank. Final step of the process is file transformation. So this is probably the most complicated of the whole process itself. And if you think about in the UK market, we have BACS, faster payments, and CHAPS as three main payment types. And what would that mean was that for most organizations, they're having to create three different payment files. By using the Actionstep and AccessPay combination, you don't need to worry about the payment files that are being generated. AccessPay takes care of all that whole process, will transform the files into the format that's required by the bank. So in that case, if it was three payment files like BACS, faster payments, and CHAPS, AccessPay will take care of that whole process and deliver the correct payment file to the bank in the right format. Okay. Final step of the process then is now the payment file has been delivered to the bank started processing it, and it's actually been settled. And the final step of the process is getting that statement data coming back, if you like, the receipts. So what payments have been made, what payments have been settled, also what credits have been received onto the bank account as well. And we can receive that using a variety of different statement data coming back from the bank. So in a nutshell, that was the 10,000 foot view of how the Actionstep and AccessPay process works.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for walking us through that. I know dealing with banks can be challenging at times. So what in your experience would you recommend law firms focus on or actually remove from a project in order that the project is a success?
Yeah, so obviously dealing with banks is not straightforward. I think we probably all have scars with some of the projects. Not necessarily the bank's fault, but just these processes are complex in their own right. So the first point is making sure that the bank offers connectivity. So we talk about corporate connectivity as a mechanism of connecting those bank accounts to your Actionstep system. And so the first point is, does your bank offer corporate connectivity? And for most UK banks, if they're working with the likes of HSBC, RBS, NatWest, Barclays, even Santander, and of course Lloyds, those banks offer standard corporate connectivity. Some of the challenger banks and some of the maybe older school banks that don't focus on corporate connectivity, such as Coots, don't offer corporate connectivity, and therefore we need to think about how else can we connect those banks to Actionstep. The second point is, okay, so we need some good project management practice. And what that means is you need to have a project manager who is able to run the project. The AccessPay and Actionstep will take up some of the heavy lifting, so that technically you don't need to do that as a law firm, but actually you're going to need some good project management who's got access to internal resources. So for example, somebody who understands what bank accounts do you have, those bank account details, what users are you going to want in the system, and to get that information so that we can then build a system for that organization. Third point is around the business case. So clearly this needs to have a business case for automation, and as I mentioned before, that the business case for automation could come from the efficiency part. So it's looking at the cost of those cashiers, that finance team logging into to bank portals versus the cost of automation. We see a business case for most organizations. The return on the investment is typically less than 3 months. So typically the business case is very strong. And then finally on timescales. So these projects, it depends on the scope of the project, depends on the number of banks, whether it's one bank that we're connecting to or multiple banks. But typically, the scope of these projects is somewhere between 4 weeks to possibly 12 weeks, maybe longer if it's more complex and there are multiple banks. But the point here is that this isn't a 12-month project. We're not designing something that's going to take a long period of time. And even if there is multiple banks involved, what AccessPay is able to do is release the project in phases. So hopefully that gives some insight into what the recommendation in terms of focus on the project process in order that a project is a success. Any questions on that, Oliver?
No, not necessarily on that. I know, those are some good kind of examples of challenges that firms might face from the bank and from the project. And when you and I were speaking previously, I remember that you had also brought up one of the law firms that you'd spoken to that had tried to create their own payment automation solution. And so I'm just curious, what types of challenges you've run into when speaking with law firms where they've tried to maybe take a different approach with payment automation and experienced challenges.
Yeah, there are really, we can summarize them or categorize them into 3 different areas. So the first is exactly what you mentioned, the DIY solution where a law firm is trying to build the service themselves. The second is around the new XML format, which is being released in 2025 by the banks. So this is referred to as XML or ISO 20022. And then the biggest challenge is possibly the do nothing. So if I take each one of those in turn, so let's go back to the DIY. So the reason why the DIY solution is extremely difficult it is one, because of the amount of effort it takes for an organization to build the connection. And the law firm, so we've there's a case study about Brown Jacobson that we've released, and we can talk about Brown Jacobson because actually they went through this process. They spent 12 months building the connection to their bank. And at the end of that 12-month process, they realized that actually what was coming around the corner very quickly was the XML ISO 20022 changes, which meant that basically they had to rebuild or having to go back to what they'd already built and spent 12 months putting together. So because of that realization, they said DIY isn't for us. And they came to AccessPay, and basically, as I mentioned, we take the heavy lifting for connecting to the bank and making sure the files, the payment files, are in the right format. So moving on to the second point, which is the ISO changes. So in May 2025, the Bank of England has specified that CHAPS property payments in particular are going to change. But then in November 2025, the format of the statement information that the banks release is going to change as well. And then later, further down the line, all other payment types will come into this new format. So that means that any organizations that has gone down a DIY route and has built their own payment integration to the bank, all that is going to have to be unpicked. And that in itself is a significant project for an organization that's not used to dealing with these types of payments. And then the third one which is probably the biggest challenge for you. I think for us, Oliver, the biggest challenge is the do nothing. And the do nothing is not because the law firm is lazy, obviously, definitely not, or not interested in payment automation. Quite the opposite. They want to do it. However, the do nothing comes around because of a priority. And the priority being that in their organization, there is something else that's happened. Maybe it's a security issue. Maybe it's something to do with a new venture that they're going down. Maybe they're acquiring a new business. And therefore, the reason why there's a do nothing is because there's a focus on another area in the organization. The use of bank portals obviously is still not going to go away. And the use of manual efficiency, the fraud and the human error, all those things that we've talked about already are going to cause the same problems. And without understanding the situation, without understanding what those priority calls are, I can't provide a silver bullet to say, well, actually, this is fine, just do this anyway. However, there are maybe some choices, and we can give some guidance and recommendation to scope out maybe a smaller initial payment automation. So rather than going for a big bang and looking at all payment types in all banks, maybe we focus on some very specific payment types that are causing some challenges. And then we phase that over a 12-month period, allowing the organization to both deliver whatever the priority ticket was, the priority challenge was in the organization, as well as payment automation.
Hmm. That's really helpful. I think the do nothing challenge is probably one of the biggest challenges we run into as well with firms that are looking at their tech stack and their practice management software. We always joke internally that our biggest competitor is status quo.
Right.
But
Yes.
well, yeah, that's really useful, Tom. Just about summarizing what payment automation means to law firms, some of the benefits and challenges. What final advice or recommendations would you give to law firms that are looking to automate their payments?
Yeah, so the current financial challenges of fraud and efficiency, as I mentioned, are not going to go away. In fact, especially with fraud, they're only going to get worse. And if the organization is expanding, or if they're looking to generate more business, then obviously that efficiency challenge of how can we process more payments is also not going to go away. Bank automation, I appreciate, may not be for everyone. And we do see some organizations that come to us and they may have a small volume of payments, which is not likely to increase. And when I refer to a small number of payments, maybe it's less than 200 payments a month, and maybe they're only working with one bank. In that case, I can understand why bank connectivity may not be on high priority list for that particular organization. However, if you are seeing payment transactions more than 200, possibly more than 500 transactions per month, and definitely if it is 500 transactions, then there is definitely going to be a business case based on what we talked about earlier. Having and even if you have a minimum of 2 or 3 cashiers in the bank portal, irrespective of the number of transactions, then that automation, that business case is definitely going to stack up. And the one that we see and we talk about is where they are multi-banked and multi-geoed. So in other words, they have more than one bank and they're operating in more than one country. So whether that's the UK and in Europe or UK and the US or whatever, those are the areas where definitely we can help with the automation process. And of course, if an organization's had a recent fraud attempt or a payment issue caused by human error, then I would strongly recommend you need to consider payment automation, like we talked about already. As we talked about, bank connectivity solves those three main challenges. So the three challenges being efficiency, fraud, and human error. And typically the business case for automation is based on efficiency alone, as it's the most tangible. But actually the driver for automation could well be based on fraud and concerns around fraud or human error, because actually the business case could be way more significant. If you think about fraud, whether that's £100,000 of fraud, more than that, 500,000, even £1 million worth of fraud, that's going to be a much more significant driver for automation than efficiency alone.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. Well, thanks for going into that, Tom. Um, I think that's all really that I wanted to cover. We do have time for a couple questions, and I do see some questions that have been submitted. So um, one question is, how does Actionstep generate a payment file? Is this a standard workflow in the system? And what is the process? So you could do this in a number of ways, but the way that most of our customers do it now is a heads up report. So you can set up a heads up report that auto generates a list to your inbox at whatever times of the day or month you need. But you can also, if a user needs a payment to be created for something specific, like stamp duty on a conveyancing case, then they can add a task reminder to create the payment request for the accounts team. So there's a few different ways, but probably heads up reports using custom
That
list views is the best way.
Yeah, that's great, and great to hear you're able to generate that payment file. And going back to that wheel slide, it's that payment file that we would AccessPay would then receive and then deliver that directly to the bank, obviously without using any online banking.
Exactly. Great. We also have a question about statements. Are we able to see our statement data?
Yes, this is a good question. So the banks can deliver back. I think I touched on this briefly when we were talking through the wheel slide. The banks can deliver back some of that statement data. And the statement information can be either an end of day statement, so that shows the opening balance, the closing balance, and all the transactions for that day. And that statement data can be seen inside the AccessPay application. For law firms, what I've seen as well, Oliver, is getting access to more real time information rather than just actually this is my daily statement. How do I know if a client has made a payment or a payment has been delivered to a client? And again, that statement data, there's a different type of data that the banks can send back, and we can surface that data up inside Access Pay, and the user can see those debits and credits almost in real time within inside Access Pay.
Great. When we've got one final question, it says, we have multiple banks and processing payments in multiple countries. How do we start a project that isn't just UK focused?
So this is the sort of multi-bank, multi-geo question. So not just UK focused, but I've got, maybe have Germany, France, might have the US. How do I start a project? What's the most important things to consider? So the starting point is really to look at your transaction volumes in those countries. A bit like I talked about before, if you're making significant volume of transactions, somewhere between 200 payments a month to 500 payments a month and upwards, then more than likely there'll be a business case justification for automation. If the volumes are slower, so if the volumes are, say, less than 100 transactions a month in those countries, then it may be that carry on using online banking for the time being, unless, of course, the organization is concerned about fraud and human error, in which case then, as we talked about, that's the business case, that's the driver for automation. But I would suggest looking at the volume of transactions in those countries and working out where the most pain point is for processing payments in those countries. And then if automation is required, then obviously we can engage with those banks, and AccessPay more than likely will be able to automate those payments for that particular law firm.
Great. Perfect. Well, I think that about wraps us up. So, Tom, thank you so much for all of your information, for your guidance, for your recommendations on how to connect Actionstep to our mutual customers' banks. And thank you all for all of your time and questions. We look forward to seeing you all again very soon. And if there is something that we haven't yet covered, feel free to email Tom directly. His email is on the screen, or you can reach out to me or your Actionstep customer success manager. More than happy to discuss this with you and explore further. But thanks again, Tom. Really appreciate all your time.
No, thank you, Oliver, and thank you, everybody.